Sketch the gradient function of the following function and state its domain. Always redraw the graph, and then the hint I can give you in this case is to redraw the new graph. So where you're going to draw the derivative, do that exactly underneath. Okay, so line up the axes. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to find where's my gradient 0. That's always the easiest. Where's my gradient 0? And my gradient 0 is always on a turning point, if you remember correct from year 8, from year 11. So gradient is 0 there, gradient is 0 there. So I'm going to say, I'm going to remember that my gradient, which is the derivative of x, equals 0. Where does that happen? That happens at where x equals -3 and x equals 1. So which means on this graph of mine, where x is -3, it's going to be 0, and at 1 it's going to be 0. So now is my turning point, where it intercepts on this graph. My next step is I'm going to look at where's my gradient, or where's my derivative of x, where is that less than 0. So where's that less than 0 is negative. So where's the gradient negative? And I also want to find out where is the gradient of f x greater than 0. So if it's greater than 0, it means it is positive. But we're looking at the gradient. So if I look at the gradient of this line here, the gradient is going up from left to right. So my gradient here, gradient is positive. At that point, my gradient equals 0. My gradient is coming down. After that point, my gradient is coming down, which means my gradient is negative. So in this part is negative. My gradient is 0 here. And then going up again, my gradient is positive. So my gradient is positive here. Positive gradient. So where's my gradient less than 0? So where's my gradient negative? My gradient is negative between -3 or -3 and 1. So -3 smaller than equal than, only smaller than x, smaller than 1. So between those two values, my gradient is negative. Where's my gradient positive? My gradient positive is where x is less than -3. So on this side of -3, and where x is greater than 1, x greater than 1, there it is positive as well. On this gradient function graph that we're going to sketch, we are not going to look at the slope now. Now we're going to say, well, it's 0 and 0 on this graph. Then it's negative, which means between -3 and 1, it is negative, which means it must be underneath the graph. So between these 2 points, the graph needs to be under the line, because that's where it's negative. And then my gradient need to be positive after or before -3 and positive above. So before this point, it needs to be in this area. Then it needs to be in this area between the 2 points, and it needs to be above the line in this point. So the only way I can do that is doing that. Okay, so what you need to remember is, we don't know where this turning point is. We don't know where this turning point happens. We just draw, because there the gradient is negative.